You would think that after Knull dominated Thanos the last time they fought, Thanos would have learned his lesson, not to mess with a guy like Knull. Knull is overpowered. This guy's cracked in Marvel. But while Thanos has always been this kind of demigod in the grand pursuit of death, destruction, and nihilism, first and foremost, he's one of the most hard-headed villains in the entirety of Marvel. So, we are back with the Knull miniseries. And what this does is it picks up with Thanos confronting Knull yet again. Now, if you're joining us for the first time, you have no clue what we're talking about. The overall gist of it is this, that somewhere along the line, Knull had returned and was captured by HELA, who was quite literally siphoning his power off of him, the ability to control the All Black, and then using it for her own nefarious purposes, likely waging some kind of a war. We didn't quite know exactly what her scheme was, but when Knull engineered his own escape and then took off out into the universe again, HELA started setting things up, and we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute, but it led to Knull and Thanos coming across each other. Knull's greater goal was to basically take the All Light, so the opposite of himself, right? Just a whole new level of power that couldn't be taken and controlled by HELA. That led to him confronting Thanos. He played possum for a minute, and then came back and dominated Thanos, and so ultimately left him for dead. But as you guys know, Thanos is not so easily killed, and so now that Knull has the All Light, this whole new source of power, Thanos is back on the affront again. And that's when he says, "So Void Creature, I see you have returned, and not as a shadow of your former self, I might add. Something far brighter, shiny spear and all it cost you was everything you once were." And that's a funny thing, right? Knull fires back and says, "You are wrong, Thanos. The exterior may have changed, but inside, I burn as darkly as ever. And you would know all about insides, wouldn't you, false god?" Because that's how Knull got the upper hand on Thanos. Quite literally, teleporting inside of him and exploding from the inside out, using the darkness within Thanos, right? And that's why Thanos says, like, "I admit, your teleportation attack caught me unawares in our first battle. My newly enhanced armor attests to that, but you are not the only one capable of surprises. Captain Linka," and then in turn, opens fire on Knull. Now, of course, Thanos knows this is not going to destroy Knull. He's well aware of that, but that's not the purpose. The purpose isn't to destroy Knull with laser beams and photon torpedoes. The purpose is to lure Knull in, because keep in mind, right, for all the craziness of Thanos, he's also a master tactician. And so you have to be prodigious, not just in terms of your level of power and how to use it, but also battle strategy to overcome someone like Thanos. And that's where Knull races towards him. And that kind of cockiness was always the major weakness that Knull had, because he says, "So you would stand by cowardly and allow your lackeys to fight for you." And Thanos says, "No, right? My lackeys are but another weapon to be used in battle, no different than the pointy stick you carry or the plasma missiles that you parry with it. No different than my fist." And that's why the recklessness of Knull catches up to him, because in that moment when he charges Thanos, it's exactly what Thanos was hoping for, right? Create a distraction here so Knull feels no other option than to attack Thanos head on. But it's also a sense of pride, right? Which is exactly what happens. He charges straight into Thanos and Thanos just clocks him, right? One good time, takes him out like that. It's not enough to defeat Knull, but it is certainly enough to remind him that when you challenge Thanos, you need to know what you're doing. And so Thanos, just walking up on him, says, "A weapon is a weapon. What matters its source? What matters its form? No, all that truly matters is the will to use it and the destructive results it provides," which is true, right? One of the funny things about Thanos in relation to a lot of villains in Marvel is that villains in Marvel tend to create this kind of arbitrary standard for themselves, right? I will not do that because I don't necessarily think it's fair. And there's truth to that, right? There's kind of like an unwritten rule in a lot of ways in the world of comics. You see that with like Flash and the Rogues. But the point of Thanos is all bets are off. There are no rules when it comes to fighting him. He will do whatever it takes in order to win. And that's when Thanos goes to pick up the spear of Knull, and he says, "How is it the Earthlings describe it? That's right, all's fair in love and war," and just stabs Knull right through the chest. And that's the funny thing, is that Knull responds and says, "Thanos, I couldn't agree more." And in that moment, pulls a spear out of himself and blasts Thanos with the power of the All Light. And so in turn, Thanos just says, "Your new powers are impressive. Not a scrap of darkness remains. Where is your void now, God of the Void?" And that's the funny thing, is Knull says, shut up, right? He's just tired of hearing Thanos talk. But when he goes on the attack, it doesn't penetrate Thanos' armor, right? And it's kind of nuts because then in that moment he asks, how in the world is this spear unable to penetrate the suit of armor that you've created? And Thanos just says, you should have gone for the head, right? Clearly a reference to the MCU, which I love the fact that he did that. He fires a blast at Knull on the spot and then just says, hypocritical fraud, you have given up everything you ever wanted just to become everything you hate, which is also true, right? Knull loves the darkness, right? He loved the all black. That was him. He was part and parcel to it, the creator of it, essentially. And now he's walked away from all of that to approach the light, the one thing he spurns the most. In fact, it was actually harming him until he got to the realm of the Illuminate, that alternate reality Eddie Brock, who had chosen the Enigma Force, right? That incredible source of energy and the source of the all-light power. Because keep in mind, Knull's currently channeling the power of what is in effect a universe. It's nuts how powerful he is, but he doesn't really have a whole lot of experience with it. And that's one of the important things to distinguish here, right? Normally when it comes to incredible levels of power like that, they exist in two forms. The first is narrative, which is to say, depending on the context of the story, that power may or may not be used a certain way. For example, Franklin Richards, who could have just snapped his fingers and ended virtually any conflict in existence, Marvel writes him out of the story, right? The Incredible Hulk's on Planet Hulk during Civil War, Thor's dead, right? That's the kind of narrative storytelling that you get when it comes to crazy levels of power. The other type of storytelling you get is what you're seeing here. Someone who's imbued with an immense level of power, but hasn't quite figured out how it works yet. They're running on the basis of it, but they don't know what higher levels they can achieve. So think Goku going Super Saiyan for the first time. He doesn't know there's like Ultra, there's 2, there's 3, there's 4 that we don't talk about, Super Saiyan God, Super Saiyan, that kind of thing. And that's kind of where Knull is. He's just attained this power, but isn't quite able to use it to its fullest capacity. And so that's when he fires back at Thanos and says, do you think I care about the color, that my void is now white and shining, or that it burns brightly forever and ever, with no life to dim it? Which is to say, his true motivation, right, beyond the original introduction, living in the void, all seem to be predicated on the fact that he wanted to be the only thing in existence, which in some ways runs contrary to the way he was originally presented to us. And so he says, to that I say, let there be light, and stabs Thanos through the head. He kills him again, right? That's why I say, you would think that Thanos would have learned his lesson. And so Knull just says, a void is a void. What matters its source? What matters its form? Farewell, Thanos of Titan, yours was a doomed cause, but points for effort and just takes off, leaving Thanos dead on the ground. And so at that point, we switch over to HELA, and this is kind of the beauty of the whole thing. With Knull pursuing the All-Light, he's essentially left the All-Black behind, which has allowed HELA to take it in its entirety, which is kind of what Marvel's been building up to for a little while, right? For about the past year or so, maybe a little bit longer with regards to HELA. But what we're told, right? Behold the Queen in Black. She should be happy. She possesses the full extent of Knull's void powers. His children, his symbiotes, now serve her, violently spreading her will and influence across the galaxy. Here is an iron fist gloved in shadowy tendrils, crushing all who would dare stand in her way. HELA of Asgard reigns supreme, and yet, as she sits atop her regal throne, contemplating her swift rise to power, happiness evades her. The crown weighs heavy, and the victories won leave her feeling naught but empty. And so she directly addresses Tyr in all of this. And so before we jump back to Knull, one of the things that I want to talk about are one of the questions that you guys had. When did Tyr and HELA become a thing? Technically, they've been a thing since Fear itself, but what you see in Marvel oftentimes is that because Tyr is part and parcel to the Asgardian mythos, you end up seeing stories whereby whatever manner and whatever means, Tyr ends up becoming a part of the escapades of Thor and Loki. And so that's what happened more recently in the Gods storyline, that Tyr was locked away inside of a Skinner box, that ultimately he's basically released and then returns to HELA. Now, in Fear itself, one of the things that it established is that they do kind of have a romantic interest in each other, but seemingly neither one can really bring themselves to admit that they have some measure of a romantic interest. Just understand their alliance here is less about him being the commander of her armies and is more about the fact that in some ways he chooses to stay. And that's why the advice that he gives her here isn't really about him leading her down the primrose path. It's true loyalty, right? She says, this is your opportunity, Tyr, Odin's son, to tell me where I went wrong. And he asks, wrong, like, what are you talking about? And he says, I would never use such a word to describe my queen. And she says, you misunderstand, General. I seek the counsel of a seasoned warrior, not the false flattery of a craven-tongued sycophant. You have not hesitated at insulting perceived discrepancies in my plan prior to this. Why start now? So speak freely or be gone from my sight. And so that's where he just says, as you wish. And he brings one of the most important things for her to understand. Because keep in mind, Tyr is also a battle-hardened warrior. This guy has seen and done it all, right? So when you're talking about a person to lead your armies, to take you to war against whatever foe you're facing off against, Tyr is 100% a guy that you want in your corner. And so he tells her, in truth, yours was a sound strategy. You were correct that the sole path to obtaining Knull's powers was via his willingness to fully sacrifice the darkness for the light of his own accord, allowing him the means to escape from his captivity, knowing he would seek out the all-light spear to counter you was a brilliantly prescient tactic, as was herding Knull into Thanos' always dangerous orbit. So the whole thing was a ruse. Knull didn't realize the whole thing was a ruse, which is actually one of the coolest elements of the story, and I'll talk about why here in a second. But Tyr continues on. The only discrepancy in your plan, if I may be so bold, is no different than that which we've already discussed. Knull himself. By all accounts, Knull's quest should have left him dead, but he is a most tenacious cockroach, easy enough to corner, but more difficult to kill. Now, here's the beauty of all of this, right? And I know I keep harping on the idea of battle strategy, but we're talking about people who are effectively ancient, right? We're not talking about Avengers, we're not talking about Captain America or Spider-Man, we're not talking about someone like Bucky Barnes, right? We're talking about beings who have been around since almost the dawn of existence, right? And so when you have someone as old as HELA, someone as old as Tyr, someone as old as Thanos, who's actually younger than both of them, and someone like Knull, who predates the current universe, came into existence between the previous universe and its current version, you're not talking about individuals who just jump into a schoolyard brawl, start punching one another to see who's really the strongest. You're talking about beings who oftentimes are caught up in their own belief systems and caught up in the way in which they see the world. And that's what you get here, right? HELA has always kind of been this person that's always looking to conquer something outside of her realm or expand her realm into other realms. And the stories go on and on and on, and they expand in a variety of ways, right? Her being ousted by Angela and then ultimately trying to take the realm of Mephisto and so on and so forth. But the bigger point that I'm making here is this: when you've been alive long enough, change becomes difficult. And when you're talking about someone like Knull, who's that ancient and that old and is so assured that his way is the right way, he doesn't really see beyond his own schemes, and he doesn't really look at the bigger picture. So he doesn't know that he's been manipulated by HELA the entire time. But with her being as old as she is, she does this kind of stuff all the time. She is duplicitous, and that's what you're getting here. It's one of the coolest elements. That's why I love the way that these characters are interacting, because HELA responds and she says, he's lost them all, his dark powers. I no longer hear him mewling within the hive mind. He has disappeared completely from the void, and only his children, my children, remain. But although I no longer sense him within, he yet lives out there. So she has the totality of his power, but he's still a threat. And she says, I have received word from Thanos, Tyr. A second confrontation with Knull appears imminent, and with it, I wonder a second defeat. And Tyr cuts her off and says, if so, Lady HELA, we will be ready to withstand whatever comes next. You seek counsel from a seasoned warrior, and you shall have it. A good general always plans for both victory and defeat. As such, I have prepared for you a contingency plan, a new course of action should the Mad Titan fail once again. And so because he did, the question now becomes, where's Knull taking off to, right? What is Knull doing? Well, that's a funny thing. It's because with HELA and Tyr looking at all of this, HELA just says that utter fool Thanos has failed me again. Now, Tyr, being as wise as he is and as old as he is, looks on this and says, Dead, are you certain, Lady HELA. And she asks, "You dare question me, General? Have I misjudged your value to me as I did the imbecilic Titans?" Now, what Tyr seems to be referring to here, although we don't necessarily get confirmation, is Thanos being barred from the realm of Mistress Death. He has been for quite some time. And there's 3 stories in recent memory that confirm that this is true. The first one is Secret Wars 2015. When Dr. Doom killed Thanos in All New, All Different Marvel, it turned out Thanos wasn't in the realm of Mistress Death. He couldn't die, so he just kind of existed outside of all of creation and then showed back up again in All New, All Different Marvel. But the 2 most recent stories are the Eternals run from Kieran Gillen and Thanos Wins from Donny Cates. In Kieran Gillen's run of Eternals, we learned that Thanos cannot truly die. He will always come back in some capacity and in some way. Seemingly he'll heal. All that really happens when it comes to this is that Thanos is defeated and then is off panel for a while and then comes back. And for the most part, Marvel just sort of hand waves it and just kind of asks us not to ask any questions, which is ultimately what happens anyway. But in Thanos Wins, Thanos survived all the way to almost the end of all things. His power had grown so great, he had destroyed virtually anyone that could challenge him in any meaningful way. He enslaved the Incredible Hulk, he destroyed Galactus, he teamed up with Cosmic Ghost Rider. It was pretty bonkers. But at the very end of that story, Mistress Death finally welcomes him back and allows him to die and to join her. And so between these 3 stories, Thanos is seemingly still barred from Death's realm, and that's why killing him is a very difficult thing to do. Tyr is most likely aware of this. HELA doesn't seem to be thinking about it. And so her response here seems to show the fact that she doesn't understand that. And that's why Tyr just says, "Your Highness, my loyalty to you is without question. It is only that Thanos may be even more difficult to kill than Knull." And so HELA just says, "Apparently not." And now Knull possesses both the All-Light Spear and light powers fully contrary to my Dark Ones. It seems the time has come to enact your alternate strategy here, and we must do so quickly. And so in the aftermath of Thanos' destruction at the hands of Knull, Knull travels to the nameless planet where Thanos had been keeping his Dark Riders. And that's one of the things that we talked about before. They debuted in Jonathan Hickman's Infinity, but for the most part, they're just cannon fodder, right? You guys saw them in Infinity War, right? Those foot soldiers that Thanos sends out there by the thousands or hundreds of thousands that just overwhelm their enemy, right? That's really all these guys are good for. But Thanos controls them nonetheless. What Knull is finding here is that while they are only foot soldiers, just kind of useless grunts to be thrown into the maw, they are still a valuable resource because they can be used in a war of attrition, overwhelming odds that wear the enemy down. And he's looking to marshal forces. And so that's why he says, "And so I have returned. Trust as I promised. He whom you once called father, Thanos of Titan, is no more, destroyed by the very spear I now hold in my hands, the same spear that transforms you." And so ultimately he uses the power of the All-Light to transform these guys into his soldiers. Not only that, he uses it on these dinosaurs, essentially. So now he's got his dragons back, which is cool, right? When Knull first appeared, he had a symbiote dragon, a Grendel, as it was called. And it was pretty badass. Like, it was pretty dope to see him riding this thing in space towards Earth. It really felt like things were gonna go sideways. And so that's why he says, "Yes, Thanos is gone. You are my children now, my dragons, and together we fly." And so that switches back over to HELA and to Tyr, because the funny thing is that with everything they're doing, she asked the question, why does this feel like a cowardly retreat? This so-called contingency plan of yours, Tyr. And he says, "I understand your concerns, my lady, but despite appearances, we are not retreating. We are regrouping. The dark game that you set in motion continues apace. It is only our position on the playing board that changes. Daedalus 5, our base of operations, is no longer a winning strategy," which is a good point, right? When you're thinking in the moment and you're not looking at the bigger picture, sure, right? Regrouping looks like retreat. But like Denzel Washington once said, this is chess, not checkers. And that's the important thing to understand here. It's not a retreat, right? It is literally marshaling their forces, backing off so you can strike again. We've seen that happen time and time again when it comes to genius battle strategies. Captain America, for example, did that during Infinity, and that's pretty much how they won. It's an incredible moment. And so at that point, you switch back over to Knull, and he says, "And so we leave behind what was to venture towards what will be, but not completely. Thanos stood opposed to me. It's true, but he was merely a pawn in another's game. game. Before HELA, before Thanos, before even the Eddie Brock who called himself Illuminated, there were others who stood against me. The original Eddie Brock and his superpowered allies, they are the others I seek long overdue vengeance against now. I will annihilate them first. Come, my bright and terrible legions, we're taking the Earth because he's launching a full attack against it yet again. But this is the irony of it. As awesome as this is, I would argue that between this comic and Infernal Hulk, this is the reason why Marvel's canceling the Storm series. Yes, they are. The next issue is the last one. We'll talk more about that when it comes out. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. If you did, drop a like. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.